Good evening, America. Tonight, we bring you a story that has shaken both Washington and Ouagadougou. At the heart of the global struggle for resources stands a young African leader who is refusing to bow to pressure. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has openly defied U.S. President Donald Trump's demand for access to 60% of the nation's gold and oil reserves. For decades, Africa has been treated as a warehouse for the West's hunger for raw materials. But today, one leader is saying no. This is more than a negotiation. This is defiance. Sources in Washington confirm that the Trump administration placed extraordinary demands on Burkina Faso, insisting that the country hand over the lion's share of its mineral wealth in exchange for so-called security guarantees and aid packages. In plain terms, the demand was nothing short of an ultimatum. Either accept Western dominance or risk isolation. But Traoré, at just 36 years old, chose a path that few African leaders have dared to walk: direct rejection of American authority. Let's be clear, the stakes here are enormous. Burkina Faso sits on untapped gold deposits, rich oil fields, and mineral wealth that could reshape its economy. For years, foreign corporations, often with Western backing, have quietly siphoned Africa's resources, leaving behind poverty, conflict, and dependency. Tonight, President Traoré has shattered that cycle. His rejection is not only financial, it is symbolic. It represents the desire of Africa to reclaim its sovereignty, to say, "Our resources are ours." Experts we've spoken to describe this as a geopolitical earthquake. One senior analyst stated, "If Traoré succeeds, other African leaders will follow. The West's monopoly over African wealth will collapse." That is the nightmare Washington and its allies fear most. Because once the dominoes start falling, there may be no stopping them. But what does this mean for the United States? The Trump administration has positioned itself as tough on trade, tough on foreign deals, and determined to secure resources for American industry. Yet this bold rejection by a small African nation exposes a critical weakness. U.S. power, once unquestioned, is now openly defied. The question is not whether Burkina Faso can withstand the pressure, but whether America can tolerate the humiliation. Tonight, images of protests are emerging from Ouagadougou's streets, where citizens are rallying in support of Traoré's decision. Chants of "Africa is not for sale" echo through the capital as young Burkinabés see in their leader a symbol of dignity and resistance. Meanwhile, in Washington, the administration faces uncomfortable questions. How far is America willing to go to force compliance? Could sanctions be on the table? Could military pressure follow? Or will the U.S. be forced to back down? This battle is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's future. Across the continent, nations are watching carefully. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea, already critical of Western influence, see in Traoré's defiance a roadmap for independence. If one leader can refuse America's demands and survive, others may be inspired to do the same. The risk of a cascading rejection of Western control is real, and that risk terrifies policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris. But critics argue that Traoré is playing a dangerous game. By slamming the door on Trump's offer, Burkina Faso may face severe economic retaliation. The U.S. dollar still dominates global trade. Sanctions could cripple the country's access to banking systems, trade networks, and even humanitarian supplies. An isolated Burkina Faso could face rising prices, scarcity of essential goods, and deepening poverty. To his critics, Traoré is gambling with his people's future in a bid for personal glory. Defenders of Traoré disagree. They argue that Africa has already endured decades of exploitation under Western partnerships. They ask, what has dependency delivered? Despite billions in loans, Africa remains poor. Despite decades of Western aid, African nations are more indebted, not less. For many, Traoré's rejection is not reckless. It is necessary. One citizen we interviewed said, "If we must suffer, let it be in freedom, not in chains." The global response has been swift. Russian and Chinese outlets have praised Traoré's decision as a turning point in Africa's struggle for autonomy. Moscow has hinted at deepening its ties with Burkina Faso, offering to fill the gap left by Washington's retreat. Beijing, too, is rumored to be considering new investment deals that would secure China access to Burkina Faso's markets. If true, this would signal not isolation, but realignment. Traoré may be closing one door, but opening others. Still, America's humiliation is profound. For decades, Washington dictated terms in Africa with little resistance. Tonight, that era looks like it may be ending. The White House has refused to release a formal statement, but insiders admit that frustration is running high. One source close to the administration told us, "Trump doesn't like to be told no. Expect consequences." The question is, what kind of consequences? This is the breaking point of a global story. Will Burkina Faso's young president withstand the storm of American retaliation? Or will the West find new ways to bend Africa back under its influence? For now, Traoré stands defiant, his message clear. Africa's resources will no longer be surrendered without a fight. And tonight, the world is watching. As the standoff deepens, questions are multiplying across the globe. Will President Trump escalate his demands into sanctions or covert action? Or will Washington's threats fall flat, revealing the limits of American power in Africa? One thing is clear. President Ibrahim Traoré has lit a spark, and that spark is spreading across the continent. Reports from neighboring nations suggest that leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea are already in quiet talks with Ouagadougou, exploring joint resistance to Western economic domination. This could represent the birth of a new African alliance, nations united not by outside dictate, but by shared defiance. Such a coalition could fundamentally shift the balance of global politics, creating a new power bloc beyond the reach of Washington and Brussels. But let's not forget the cost. Burkina Faso is a small nation with limited economic strength. Its gold and oil reserves are valuable, but without the infrastructure and global market access that Western systems provide, it faces immense hurdles in monetizing those resources independently. To succeed, Traoré will need not just bold words but concrete strategies. That means new trade partners, new financial systems, and new alliances willing to invest in Burkina Faso's future. And that is where Russia and China come in. Both nations are positioning themselves as the champions of an alternative world order, one where the U.S. no longer sets the rules. Russian state media is already framing Traoré as a hero of anti-imperialism, a David standing up to America's Goliath. Beijing, ever pragmatic, sees opportunity. Chinese investment has transformed economies across Africa before, and in Burkina Faso, it may do so again. But here lies a danger, rejecting one master only to embrace another. Will Burkina Faso truly achieve independence, or simply trade one set of chains for another? Domestically, Traoré's gamble has electrified his citizens. Crowds flood the streets in celebration of his courage, waving national flags, chanting slogans of pride. For a people long accustomed to seeing their wealth drained away, this act of defiance is a moment of dignity. Yet behind the jubilation lies anxiety. Will jobs disappear if sanctions hit? Will food prices soar? Will daily life become harder? The burden of resistance often falls not on leaders, but on ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, American policymakers are scrambling. Some advocate harsh sanctions to force Burkina Faso back into line. Others warn that punishing Traoré could backfire, fueling even greater resentment across Africa and accelerating the continent's drift toward Moscow and Beijing. Inside the Pentagon, contingency plans are being drafted. Officially, the U.S. speaks of diplomacy. Privately, it considers pressure, and perhaps worse. The larger question is whether America can adapt to a changing world. For decades, the West operated under the assumption that African nations had no choice, that dependency was permanent, that rejection was unthinkable. Traoré has shattered that illusion. By saying no to Trump, he has proven that alternatives exist. He has shown Africa that the West can be challenged, and that may prove more dangerous to Washington than the loss of any oil or gold. History may remember this as the turning point, the moment when a young African president told the world's most powerful man that Africa would no longer be treated as a colony. The echoes of that defiance are already being heard across the continent. For Washington, the nightmare scenario is not Burkina Faso alone. It is Burkina Faso leading a movement. So where does this end? Will America double down, unleashing its full might to crush this rebellion? Or will it retreat, conceding ground in a part of the world it once dominated? The answers will define the future of U.S.-Africa relations for a generation. But for now, the image is clear. Ibrahim Traoré standing firm, refusing to sell his nation's soul for promises and pressure. One man against an empire, one nation against the tide of history. And as the dust settles, one truth emerges. Africa is no longer silent. Its leaders are no longer compliant. Its people are no longer willing to accept exploitation as destiny. Tonight, Burkina Faso has spoken, and the world cannot ignore it.